So it's that time of year again. The weather's not great outside. We want to get ready for a new season ahead, and we want to do some decent training in the garage or in wherever our turbo or trainer happens to be. And the first thing you need to do decent training is work out where your zones are. What are zones and why do you need them? Well, keep on watching to find out. I'm David and this is Forest Fellow. So what are zones? Well, zones were set up by some sports scientists a while ago, and they realised that our body's energy systems can be turned into or thought of as different zones, from very easy zones to very hard flat out zones. And often people work in a 6 or 7 zone model, 1 being really easy, 2 being your aerobic or zone 2, which you may have seen about. And if you want to find out more, I'll link to a video down below on zone 2 riding, which really helps develop your aerobic capabilities. And then zone 3 is sort of tempo. It's sort of quite hard. You can probably do it for a couple of hours, but it's not too hard. Threshold, zone 4, is really where we're looking at today, and I'll tell you why a bit later. But that's your sort of threshold power, you can do for about an hour. And after that, zone 5 is your VO2 max, so working at the top level of your oxygen use. And then zone 6 is anaerobic, so working really hard without oxygen. And then you could go on to zone 7, which is, you know, your absolute flat out max power capabilities. So why do we need zone 4? Well, zone 4 is your threshold, and most zones are calculated really from your threshold. And your threshold equates to, well, the idea of it is it equates to your lactate threshold. And that's where, when you're training, whenever you're doing exercise, your muscles are producing lactate, which is a byproduct of the exercise, which then can be used as a fuel later. But basically, your body has to get rid of it and it has to process it. And the speed at which you process it is what being aerobic or being fit is all about. And threshold is that point where your body is tipping over into, it's getting so much lactate it can't handle it anymore, and you get overwhelmed with lactate, and then you know, blow up, to use a better word, and you can't go on anymore. And Coggan and others thought of that as being about your hour power. If you go flat out for about an hour, he seemed to equate that to roughly what your lactate threshold was. So when we do testing to find out what our threshold is, so we can then set our zones from that, the idea isn't to get, as I've seen on some videos recently, a bigger power as possible. You're not trying to do different tests to see which one gives you the best threshold to use that in a, you know, in your workouts. You're trying to work out your threshold from doing tests, which is as near as you can get to your lactate threshold. So in a way, there's no point, you know, trying to get huge numbers and doing tests which give you the biggest number so it looks good, because that might not really be where your threshold is. So what tests can you do? If you're enjoying this content and finding it useful, don't forget to like and subscribe. I know a lot of people watch the videos but don't always subscribe. It's really going to help the channel if you subscribe as well. So please, if you can, don't forget to click that button. So if you want to find out your levels, you can do a variety of tests. And, you know, obviously if you are a rider that does a lot of steady riding, you're climbing, you do 20-minute efforts quite often, or half-hour efforts or hour efforts going up a hill or mountain, or you're doing time trialing, you might be suited better to a longer, you know, FTP test. You might be suited better to a longer FTP test. If you are someone that does a lot of short, sharp efforts, you might be suited more to a ramp test to give you a more accurate sort of figure. Or, you know, you might end up with a better figure from those tests if you do those sorts of activities. But ramp tests are quite easy. They normally last about 15-20 minutes. It starts off nice and easy, gently rolling. So with ramp tests, they basically go up every minute. You're doing an extra 25 watts or something like that. And you just keep going until you can't do any more. So it's a nice easy test. You don't have to pace yourself. It's only really sort of horrible and really hard work in the last 3 or 4 minutes probably. And that can give you a estimate of your FTP. And they, like I know Trainer Road takes something like 75% of your last 1 minute effort. Another test you could do is the old standard, the 20-minute effort, where you go flat out for 20 minutes, don't go out too hard, take it nice and steady, but as hard as you can for 20 minutes. And from that, you get, or you multiply it by 0.95 to find out 95% of that amount, which should give you an FTP from that. Sometimes people in the past have done 2 by 8 minutes. So again, you do the same thing, 2 8-minute efforts spaced out with a bit of a break between, about 10-minute break between, but 8 minutes as hard as you can, followed by another 8-minute effort as hard as you can. You take the average of those and then do 0.9 of that. So that's 90% of a shorter effort. Or if you really want to, and you're a real glutton for punishment, you could really find your hour power and go out and ride for an hour and see how long you can ride or how much power you can produce in an hour. Probably the easiest way at the moment to do FTP calculations is if you use Trainer Road. They've got an AI FTP detection, which is based on your outside rides as well as your inside rides, and that will sort of estimate your FTP. So you get given a value of your FTP at the end. It could be 200 watts, 250 watts, 300 watts, whatever it is. And then if you've got that value, you can then calculate your different zones from it. So if you go on the web and type in FTP calculator, I know British Cycling do a really good one. You can go in, you can put in your FTP power or your 20-minute power, and that will automatically calculate all your different zones. So when you're doing zone 2 over the winter, you'll actually know you're working in your zone 2. And if you're doing threshold efforts, you know you're working around your FTP or threshold. So it really helps your training to be in the right zone. If you're going to sit in a garage all winter like this, doing training, doing efforts, you want to make sure you're in the right ballpark when you're doing them. So, I mean, in the past, what I have done is when I've got an FTP, I have tried to ride for at least half an hour or 40 minutes at that FTP to see if it's about right. And if you find you can only do, if you do a ramp test and you can only hold that for 20 minutes, it's probably not going to be your FTP. It's probably too high. Likewise, if you've got a test, you've got a number and you ride and you can ride at that for an hour and 10 minutes, it's probably too easy. So I think it's worth doing that just to try, as I said in the first place, to match your FTP as closely as you can to what it really is, what your functional threshold power or your second aerobic threshold, that lactate threshold, matching your FTP to that as closely as possible. It's well worth it in the long run. If you are training in too high an FTP, you'll end up just training the wrong zone. So when you'll think you're doing, threshold work and you're not, you're doing VO2 max work, which is why maybe you're failing your sessions and things like that. So take a bit of time doing it. Choose an FTP protocol, an FTP test to use, and stick with it. If you're going to do one, you want to really make sure you keep doing the same one, so you know you've got similar sort of answers at the end of your sessions. And over the winter, it's well worth doing it a couple of times to see if you're improving or to make sure, as I said, you're in the right zones when you're doing your training. So hope you found that useful. If you did, don't forget to click that like button and subscribe. And until next time, happy training. I'll see you soon.